Welcome to the Redefining Sales podcast, where we unpack the future of sales together. Welcome to the Redefining Sales podcast. My name's Abby White. I'm the CEO of Sales Redefined and your host for the Redefining Sales podcast. Today, we have with us Holly Ransom, who is honestly one of the most remarkable people I have ever met. She is incredible, and I cannot wait to share this episode with you. So before we dive into the conversation, a tiny bit about Holly. Holly is an expert in disruption and future leadership. She is the founder and CEO of Emergent. She was named one of Australia's 100 most influential women by the Australian Financial Review. She's delivered a peace charter to the Dalai Lama, interviewed Barack Obama on stage, was Sir Richard Branson's nominee for Wired magazine's Smart List of Future Game Changers to Watch in 2017, and was awarded the US Embassy's Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Leadership in 2019. Holly is a Fulbright Scholar and Harvard Kennedy School Class of 2021 Fellow. And The Leading Edge, which we refer to quite a lot in the conversation, is her first book. So in this conversation, we delve into the topic of leadership. We delve into how to ask great questions and why we should be asking great questions. We talk about connecting with our why. We talk about looking risk in the eye, which I love. I'm going to give a parental warning as a mum. We also talk about whether it's a hell yeah or a fuck no. So there's definitely a language warning for you there. And we talk about what did Holly notice was a common thread and common theme from meeting Richard Branson, Barack Obama, Malcolm Gladwell, and so many other leaders at the top of their game. So there is just so much in this conversation that I want to share with you. So without further ado, please welcome Holly Ransom. Welcome to the Redefining Sales podcast. Today we have the magnificent Holly Ransom. Welcome.
Thanks, Abby. Good to be here.
So I want to dive straight in because I've got so many questions that I want to ask you. I had to hold myself back. I want to start with the foundation. So I've been reading Holly's book, and I actually am going to embarrass myself and show, look at the terrible coffee marks I've got over the book, but it shows that it's been read.
Well loved.
And that it's well loved, and it hasn't just sat on the shelf. It's definitely appearing well loved.
Love seeing that.
So Holly's book, The Leading Edge, which I'm very much in love with, and it's a really interesting point for me as we're sort of coming into FY24 and into planning mode. I feel like it's a really good time to read, reflect on it, because you ask some bloody big questions. And I think it's great, that start of a fresh financial year. It's a great time to look at it. I don't know whether other people find that or just me, but that's certainly what I'm finding.
I'm glad to hear it, because that was a big part. For those who haven't read the book yet, every chapter, I like to think, is pragmatic to begin with, but certainly ends with a question that you're prompted to reflect on at the end of it. So, Abby, I don't know if there was any ones in particular that you were left ruminating over and thinking about as you end the financial year, but my hope is to try and close the knowing and doing gap. So the book is really written in a way where I hope, as opposed to what we know happens a lot of the time with books, where we read it and go, oh, that was really interesting, and then we put it back on the shelf and we don't do much with it. This is really geared to help you apply it and help you to think through how these ideas might translate into your own life. So that's a big part of why I ask those big meaty questions at the back end of chapters.
I was telling Holly that I'm about to go away to the UK and then to Switzerland and go hike up a mountain. And ironically, in Holly's book, there's an example about going up a mountain somewhere. I was like, you must have known. And I was saying, like, it's so good because I feel like some of those questions I need to ponder for a period of time. So it's been great because when I'm training and you're out for a walk for like a long period of time, you can really ponder, and rather than just brush over a question and go, oh yeah, I'll come back to that. Oh, I'll come back to that. Like you just said, that knowing doing. I do feel like it's creating space to reflect on it.
Yep, absolutely. And that's the one. I think one of the things we often struggle to make time for in the busyness of life as it is now is that discipline of reflection. And one of the things that we know is our brains need space to make meaning of ideas and to think about the application of them. I know, and I've been guilty of this in my own life. You know, I've got notebook after notebook that's filled with all these fabulous sessions that I went to, or interesting ideas that I heard, or thoughts that I had. But making sure I've created space in a week or in a month to think about, okay, you know, what I want to do with some of those ideas that I've heard, or really great thought bubbles that were prompted in me by listening to a great speaker. I think that's often the part that we miss. So I love that you're going up a mountain and creating that space for yourself.
Yeah, my brother told me that he heard, I can't remember who he heard this from, but he was telling me, you can only have, because I have like books everywhere. If I panned my camera, it's actually quite embarrassing. They're just all over the floor and should be in a much better system. They were nice and color-coded on the shelf, and then it went to shit. But anyhow, he was telling me that you should have just a few books, and then you're not allowed to move on to the next book until you've done and you've executed the things you wanted to from those books. And I was like, that is so interesting. And that's what I'm kind of doing with yours at the moment and obsessing over, because then you really are, it's not that sort of shelfware. You're actually putting it into real world.
I mean, that's impressive accountability. I think most of us, hand on heart, would go, geez, I wouldn't be moving on from books if I had my feet held to the fire in that way. I love that idea. I'm looking forward to hearing how you go with it. I think your brother's a great source of inspiration there.
I'm not sure he does it. He just talks about it. We'll find out. He's getting stuck.
Okay, investigate that.
So on the back of the book, you have a really, really nice line that I absolutely love, where you said leadership is within everyone's reach, everyone's ability, and everyone's power. And I really like that, because I've heard a lot, and I've trust me, had moments myself where you go, oh, I'm not sure I'm cut out for this, or I'm not sure I'm a leader, or I'm not a natural leader. What do you say to someone if that's the thought process, if that's the belief?
I think it comes down to definition, right? And I think some of us have chosen to define leader in a way that excludes us out or looks differently to us. And in fairness, that's almost part of what I realized was the problem with the category. When I went to go and write my book, I started by going and doing kind of the leadership literature review of everything that exists out there in the leadership library as it stands right now. And it's pretty monodimensional, right? It's a lot of stories of Jack Welch type figures, titans of industry at companies in the industrial age like GE, or it's a lot of stories of male military generals on the battlefield. And I can understand why, when that's what we've perpetuated leadership to look like, a lot of people go, oh, that's not me. I'm not cut out for that, or that's not the type of person I am, or I can't see myself in these stories and examples, so maybe I'm not a leader. And you and I both know, Abby, that's not true of what we see leadership to look like every day. I mean, just think about the network of leaders that you work with in your business, small business owners, leaders who are managing people and big accounts inside organizations, people who are champions for their community. You know, in reality, for me, I think each and every one of us, in my definition, is a leader each and every day. And why? Because there are people in our lives who look to us for influence, for guidance, for support. Our friends, our family, colleagues, you can define your scale and you can define your sphere of influence. But in reality, that's leadership in action. That is the what we are doing day to day in life. Now, there's a question of whether we're doing that for better or for worse, and whether we're really seizing that opportunity and thinking thoughtfully about the way that we're showing up in those moments and influencing and using our leadership to help people out, to mobilize towards a goal, to be able to achieve something, or to be resilient together, or whatever the challenge may be in front of us. But for me, there's no question, we need to reclaim what leadership means. And in doing that, I believe each and every one of us needs to see ourselves in that word, because critically, when you look at the scale of the challenges that are facing us, it's going to take each and every one of us changing, shifting, working together to be able to make headway on things like climate change and moving towards net zero, and the reality of how we might tackle, you know, the global instability and polarization. I mean, each and every one of us has a role to play in that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think it's also that everyone has those moments of doubt and, you know, oh, is that for me? I did a really powerful exercise once when I was at a Business Chicks event, and I won't say who I was sitting next to, but I was sitting next to a CEO of a very incredible charity who that I just look at and go, oh my God, the impact they're making, what they're doing, just absolutely incredible. And we had a moment where Kemi Nekpaville, I always butcher her surname, Kemi, who I love, got us to speak to the person next to us about like a fear that you don't talk about, or something. I'm butchering the story, but something like that. And she basically said, I'm really like, I worry, and she was in tears, that I'm not going to be able to achieve our goal and our mission as a charity, and that, you know, I'm just not going to get us there. And I almost fell off my chair, just going, oh my gosh, I'm looking at like what you're doing is so incredible, so inspiring. And I just would never even think that thought would cross your mind. And then you looked around the room and you heard some of the stories around the room. It's like everyone's human and had that moment of, oh,
Totally.
can I do it? Am I enough?
And I think that's true. And Abby, you've probably seen that in the stories I feature in the book, but it's one of the more humbling things, and certainly one of the things I get the great privilege of interacting with really regularly in the work that I do, getting to host an interview right around the world, is that you meet these leaders that in so many ways I think many of us project onto and assume, oh, well, the reason they're able to do that, to your point, is, oh, they must just have no fear, or they must have just been born with this innate capability to be able to overcome challenges like that. In reality, they have fears like we do. They have concerns about inadequacies. They have the ability, though, to go, I'm going to feel that, I'm going to choose to do it anyway, or I'm going to work to find a way to overcome that fear and tell myself a bigger reason why that's going to help me to overcome it. So when I feel that rushing up, I can remind myself why I'm doing it, and I can continue to commit myself to the work in the face of that sense of overwhelm that's starting to creep up inside me. So I think you're right. Like it really comes down to, in many ways, the stories that we're telling ourselves, and that telling ourselves we're capable of being a leader, telling ourselves a story that encourages us to demonstrate more of the traits that we want to see. But absolutely, there isn't a person alive that doesn't have moments of doubt, that doesn't have, moments of fear. And to be frank, if there were, you'd have to question whether or not they were living ambitiously. You'd have to question whether they were, doing things that were difficult and hard, because if you're interacting with the world as dynamic and ever-changing as it is, and if you're trying to make big goals happen, as so many of your listeners are, there's, of course, that reality that we're periodically interfacing with that. The challenge is, and part of what I try and develop some strategies around in the book, how do we equip ourselves with the tools and the support structures that when we face those moments, we can find a way through, over, round, under, because they will come. So a lot of my want when we talk about leadership is, how do we make it pragmatic? I get frustrated sometimes by how ambiguous or intellectualized the concept is in a way that loses its pragmatism. And for me, it's more about, how do we make this practical, so you've got the strategies at hand to be able to find a way to make this work in your life to help support you to get the goals achieved that you've got for yourself.
Yeah, I definitely feel that in the book. And that's what I like about the end of chapter questions and so the way you guide people through. So on that note, you start out very early on in the book talking about anchoring to purpose and connecting to why. And this is one that I feel is so interesting, because it kind of falls into that category sometimes of like easier said than done. So
yeah.
And it's funny because a couple of years ago when Simon Sinek, was going crazy, obviously he's still going crazy, but I got the workbook that you do for that goes alongside his book around connecting to your why, and, it starts with why and all the rest of it. And some of it you just you get so stuck on and in your head. And then I found, being completely honest, some of it felt insufficient, because my why wasn't to go and, save the world. And so you then go, oh God, is my why not right? It's not, and so on. So I want to hit on that note around how we start with anchoring to purpose and finding our why and those practical steps.
Yeah, so you've raised a couple of good things there, one of which I think is this importance of making sure we don't judge our own why. The more important thing is that we find it and that we own it than it is that we try and contort it to something that we think is going to be acceptable to others. And I agree, in sort of an age where I think, this culture that we've had in Silicon Valley for the last, 2 decades or so, where, if the idea is not going to touch 500 million lives, it's not worth getting out of bed for, etc., I think has just scaled everything up so dramatically. And I hear this from leaders all the time, where is just doing X enough? Or can I just be passionate about being, insert whatever they might be, or insert however their role might be defined in their own head? Absolutely it is. If that's for you, purposeful and meaningful, that is fantastic. And that's the most important thing. For me, it's about, the question is, does it light your fire? It doesn't matter whether it does that for anyone else. It's really a question of what gets you motivated and gets you out of bed. Now, I meet a lot of people who say, I don't have the answer to that yet. And I think that's an important place to acknowledge that some people listening to this might go, I don't think I've ever found that for myself, but might be interested in tapping into it. And I think the best advice, and I offer it in that chapter in the book, that I was ever given is from a mentor of mine by the name of Jane Shuson, who founded Comic Relief in the UK. Been an incredible charitable organisation that's raised more than $1 billion for a variety of fantastic causes. And she talks about this idea of you've got to put yourself where the lightning strikes. So that idea that if I just keep living in my routine and my habits, and I'm just expecting my why one day to come out of the blue and, sideswipe me, and all of a sudden I'm going to know what it is, we're not putting on ourselves on a track to likely success there. So we need to think about what's the way I'm going to thoughtfully disrupt my routine, habits, mindsets in a way that might allow me to come into contact with my why. And by that, I mean, you'll have natural things that you can talk underwater about. You will have things that you find you lose track of time when you're doing. Start there and be curious. Hansel and Gretel style, that's the breadcrumb trail that's going to lead you somewhere. So what you need to start thinking about doing is, okay, how could I spend a little bit more time exploring ways I might play with that flow state? Okay, I find when I get engaged in creative tasks, I really lose myself in it. Okay, well, where else might I be able to think about applying that? Could I go and volunteer for an organization that I find I'm just really passionate and I read about all the time, and see if maybe there's an opportunity for me to apply my skills to a totally different cause, and I'm going to find connection and purpose there. So I encourage people to go on a curiosity journey and just think about giving yourself a little bit of bandwidth to do it. So it might be that you make a commitment once a month, I'm going to do something that I think might put me where lightning strikes, and just see and reevaluate after you've gone and done it. Did I get closer? Do I feel like I was close to where it strikes? Or maybe that was a misadventure this month. How might I go again? If you're prepared to make that commitment, I haven't met anyone yet that in remaining consistent to that hasn't connected with a deeper purpose over a period of time. Now, there's no magic number for how long that takes, but starting that journey of inquiry is where it begins.
How do you differentiate between what, therefore, where the lightning strikes is a hobby and what actually I'm going to build a career around?
Yeah, and look, this is a really important piece. Scott Galloway, I was hearing him talk the other day, quite controversial sometimes with what he says. And he was sort of saying, the worst advice you can get in life is to go and follow your passion. Now, I'm not someone who advocates what Scott says there, but I appreciate that sometimes that in its purest form doesn't set us up for success. In that, absolutely, you're right, Abby. Sometimes there's a case where we need to be thinking about, okay, was the thing I really love the thing that I do as a side hustle? Is the thing that I really love the charity I commit my volunteer time to, and then my work's over here? Each of us has to navigate what that looks like for ourselves. And I guess for me, that moves us to a topic I talk about in the book called choice criteria. So it's thinking about what are your filters for making decisions, and each and every one of us is different. So I can't say that for every person, you should be able to pursue your purpose and your reason why should be in what you do every minute of every day, because for some of us, that's not the filter and the choice criteria that we are making decisions through. We've got other priorities, whether it's financial demands that we might have for our family, whether it's the reality of personal circumstances and what we're able to do. The more important thing for me is we understand and are really clear on the criteria that we're making our choices through. And again, I encourage people sometimes, if you don't feel like your purpose is in what you do for a majority of your week, is there a different story you can tell yourself about what you're doing for a majority of your week? So I've met people whose, Abby, to your point, their work is their work and it's what helps them support their family. Now that for me is a really purposeful thing to be doing. So as opposed to telling yourself a story that, your job every day is about reconciling spreadsheets or something like that, which is a pretty hard narrative to get excited about. I hear it. Why don't you tell yourself a story about how you going to work every day is helping to provide opportunity for your family? It's setting your next generation up for optionality that you never had growing up. Things like that. A lot of this is down to the story that we choose to tell ourselves. And there's an option every day to pick a different narrative and see if trying that on for size gives us a greater level of motivation. So I do think it's a little bit of both. I think it's understanding your choice criteria and realizing that your pure passion, I've met a lot of people whose pure passion is sport, for example, and unfortunately they weren't blessed with the skills that have enabled them to pursue the highest level of professional sport and whatever they're passionate about. So it absolutely is their weekend hobby. But there's a better way that we can talk to ourselves about what we're doing 9 to 5 or during the week in whatever form that is too, that can help us connect with the why more effectively.
I'm just checking whether I needed to give up my career and start something around dogs. Because if I look at where have I volunteered, where have I spent time?
I've heard you talk about sales, and I don't think for a second you don't find your why in that. Nice try. Your passion that comes out of you.
It's the sales side and the crazy dog lady side, and that's where I definitely volunteer. Is like I've volunteered at the dog rescue center, so I just need to find something that's around sales and dogs, and then I'm home and dry.
Watch out online pet stores. Abby's coming for you.
Oh, I'm gonna go do that. Okay, so the next one I really want to ask you is, you talk in the book about look risk in the eye. And that was a line that I read and I was like, oh, that's juicy. And I found it really...
Why did that land for you, can I ask? What was it about that really jammed?
I think it's the time. So, the time Holly and I are having this conversation, we're coming last week of financial year. I'm really mentally thinking about FY24, and I'm sure a lot of the audience are the same, reflect on where to for FY24. And I think you do have that point of going, right, what do we want to accomplish next year? What do we want to go after? For me, definitely, do I want to take that risk? Do I not want to take that risk? Do I want to go for that one, not that one? And so I think it's a point in time reflection, and that's probably why it was like, whoa, that's interesting. And so I'm curious about that, around you explaining that concept, but also how, if we look risk in the eye, we might be a bit bolder, a bit braver around our FY24 strategies. Because I'm sure I'm not the only one alone at this point in time in the year where you start to think about that for the year ahead.
No, it's a great point. And for me, particularly, I guess, speaking of, why might it matter more in this moment in time, or I do think there's something to be said around the way that we need to think about risk in sort of an era of uncertainty, which is certainly the one I think we are living and leading and working through at this moment in time. And it's not to say, obviously there's always been an element of risk in life in general, but just with the pace of change, with the rate of disruption, there seems a degree of chaos and unpredictability that we're becoming accustomed to now as the new normal, for the want of a better description than that I think just means we need to consider risk a little bit more proactively. And so, one of the things I talk about in the book is just some strategies for how you can think about front footing it and actively bringing it into your frame of mind more regularly and using strategies. One of the things I find about risk is it tends to be a part of the meetings, around board tables and leadership teams, where we watch half of the team's eyes glaze over and they fall asleep and they disengage a little bit. And so we have to make risk a little bit more real and a little bit more active, but we also need to think about the process in it. One of the reasons with the organizations that I've historically worked with that I typically see, I've seen CRO, Chief Risk Officer reports tabling 150 pages, and I must admit, a handful of times in different capacities, I used to embed jokes at about page 57 of the reading papers, just to see if anyone was actually reading their papers cover to cover, which is a good strategy for anyone who's preparing long reports. It really tells you who's reading your who's reading your notes and who's not.
I've always wanted to do it in tender.
What's that? Yeah, well, exactly. You see how thoroughly people read things in a heartbeat, but. One of the things I talk about is that you really need to think about process, because like anything, it's a bit challenging to just sort of go, okay, we want to talk about our blind spots. We want to talk about the things we might not be prepared for, and just open up a conversation around the table that we always sit round, and think that that's going to deliver the sort of thinking that we're after. And so a couple of strategies I talk about in the book is, how do you play with structure and process differently? So things like engaging in a pre-mortem. So you think about your financial year for 23-24 and you go, okay, if we were to be dead on arrival, like if we would not even get close to the goals that we set for ourselves, what would be the likely causes of death? And there's a couple of reasons this is a useful strategy for us to think about when it comes to framing up our risks for the year. One reason that's really useful is because we're having that conversation at the time where we've got the greatest ability to change the outcome, because we've got the agency of 12 months worth of runway. We're not having this conversation in April next year where we get next to no leverage in how we might change a result. So that's one reason. The even bigger reason it's useful is because from a behavioral standpoint, when we're asking people to nominate and suggest those ideas, we're doing it kind of forward looking as opposed to retrospectively. And that means we don't have any ego, baggage, or performance reviews of anyone on the table. We're not saying, oh, it'll be because Jane didn't, get across the marketing brief properly. It'll be because, Doug didn't get the plan for that project delivered on time, and so we dropped the ball with a key client. What we're actually doing is saying, oh, it might be because, one of our team members, or we're not adequately resourced in this area, or we last year weren't clear enough about what we were saying yes to and no to, and we spread ourselves too thin. And if we did that again, we'd probably fall over this year. And so it's a really useful way of having a really honest conversation about risk in a way that keeps a lot of the dynamics that often don't see those things brought to the table out of the room. And so I really encourage people to think about strategies or nominate someone in your team. The Israeli army have this thing called the 10th man, where there's a person on the team. We can call them the 10th person to be a little bit more mindful in our workplaces. But the idea that someone's actually given the brief to come in and challenge thinking. Their job is to go, why wouldn't it work? Their job is to go and seek information from different points of the organization and to push and to prod. Now, that for me is going to create a really different outcome to if we say, okay, anyone got any other thoughts at the table, and just hope someone's going to come in and constructively challenge. So the idea that someone's job description is to bring risk forward and to poke and prod our ideas so we get more robust in our thinking. These are some of the ways I think as business people, particularly heading into a new financial year, having some of these conversations in the June, July period, or, in that first quarter of a new financial year, just helps us get ahead of it.
I love that. And that inspired me actually, because we used to do, before campaigns, we used to do like a pre-mortem. Okay, what could not work on this campaign? What could go wrong? What would make us not get an ROI? And I read it and I was like, I can't believe we just suddenly fell out of doing that, because it was actually so powerful. Why did we ever stop doing that? Don't know. So it was actually an inspiring moment for me. So I was like, oh, we need to put that back in. That was great. And you're right. It's a completely...
And can I say, I love it in your context too, because that's a great way of constantly testing your assumptions. Like, your market is so dynamic, and so you're having to make decisions on a lot of real-time information, and okay, we think this bet's going to work because we're seeing this trend, and so we're backing it this way. It's a really good way of continually coming back and going, how well were we reading the market and getting and interpreting the information we were receiving? I love that.
Yeah, and to your point, it's not confrontational, because then we're going, well, this campaign might not work because we might have a challenge with the client's bandwidth on X, and it might be something completely different like that. We go, okay, well, how can we navigate that? How can we upfront have that conversation now? Interesting.
Whereas in 6 months of you having that conversation, you're either being critical of the client or you're being critical of the team member that was managing the client relationship that didn't bring them to the table. And I think the other thing too that I find valuable about it is I've always believed to be forewarned is to kind of be forearmed. And so in that regard, even if some of that doesn't come true, we're more alert to the signals. And so when we see them come up, we're more proactive as a team for how we get on the front foot and go and do something about them. And so that speed of responsiveness, which we know is so critical, we're not at that point in time starting the deep dive. We're going, oh, that was the trend we were worried about. Let's jump in. We had a conversation about this. And so we can pick up where we left off over here, and we're likely to be able to solve for it faster.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. We've even put it into what we have kept was we even put it into our checklists of when we're doing like our peer review and our sign-off process. We've got certain things that highlight red as a red flag, and like that's high risk. And even things like that just make you look at it differently and go, oh, I need to watch that. It's okay, but I need to watch it. So I love the concept of the pre-mortem. It's so powerful.
Awesome. Well, I hope many are inspired to give it a go. It's a perfect time of year to be doing it too. It's a great activity for any bookend. So start of quarter, end of quarter, start of year, end of year. I find them really useful frames to put onto, just reflecting on decision making and trying to get ahead of what might be around the corner for us next.
Yeah, love it. So next thing that struck me, and I loved this one, and it's actually made me already make a different decision in my team and in my life. So I love this one, and I want to talk about it and share it with other people. You talked about being in tune with opportunities coming up, and it's whether it's like a hell yeah or it's a fuck no. And I love this, probably because there was swearing involved. I loved it even more. And I really liked that concept of getting in tune with it. But I was also really curious about it because I thought back to certain things. Like when I was initially asked, do I want to go into sales? It was a fuck no. And I had this misconception that it was like, oh, no. And I think that that's interesting. And then I look at some of the decisions, you know, in life where you go, am I walking away too soon? Because you've got to go through the trenches to get to the good stuff on the other side. So I really wanted to talk to you about this concept because, again, point in time as we're starting the new financial year, great time to reflect on what's a hell yeah, what's a fuck no. And just reading your books made me make a different decision in my business alone. Can you talk to us about this concept? And then where's that line?
Yeah, and the thing is, and I love those examples that you've given, the line's going to look different for each of us, depending on what our criteria are. So this gets back to what we were talking about a little bit before on that idea of filter criteria. And for me, and I should reference that, you know, it's a quote attributed to a great mentor of mine, Lane Beachley, who sort of has been quite a pivotal voice in my ear at many moments in my career, but gifted me that phrase of it's either a fuck yes or it's a hell no. So which one is it? You know, as kind of a simple frame of if you can't get that fired up around what it is that you're going to work on, what it is that you're doing every day, then it probably in and of itself is your answer. And to link it up, I guess, to a business leader, many of us would know it's a slightly more crass way of saying something Jobs used to say at Apple, where he'd say, you know, the things that we say, I'm as proud of the things that we say no to at Apple as the things that we say yes to, because it's through saying no that we truly say yes. And so it is really that idea that I think many of us have difficulty with saying no, or maybe aren't as discerning with setting the bar for what we say yes to. I think when you look at the rates of burnout writ large at the moment, there's a fair indication that we're all burning all cylinders, all ends of the day, and probably there's a challenge for a lot of us around prioritization and putting boundaries up and working out what are we saying yes to. And I'm hearing this conversation a lot at the moment from leaders who are going, oh my gosh, you know, in this environment economically that we're heading into for the back half of 23, I'm being told I need to do more with less, and so it's taking on a different challenge at the moment. But where this really starts is this idea of coming back to, you know, what is it that you want to make your criteria for decision making? It's a way of framing your choices, because in reality, we are making thousands of choices any given day. And so it's important to think about what is it that's guiding them. And Abby, to your examples you were giving earlier, you know, there are certain times in your life where you might be choosing to be in a difficult or a challenging environment for reasons that are other than environmental. You know, your main priority at that moment in time may not be, do I love going to work every day? It might be the stability of making sure I'm getting a paycheck. It might be, I've got a really great opportunity to learn here, and as tough as it is, if I can do 12 months here, it's going to be a great entree into what I want to do next. And so that might frame a really different choice to someone in that moment who's going, you know what, there's nothing more important to me than enjoying where I show up every day. And so if that's not what I can get out of this environment, I need to make a choice to go elsewhere. The point is less around the idea that one set of criteria is right or wrong. The key bit for me is around knowing what your criteria are, checking in with it regularly. I sort of create the analogy to a coffee filter. The idea that with your coffee filter, or some of you might filter water or whatever, you need to change that filter regularly. So you can't leave it for 5 years and come back and think that's still going to reflect your priorities or still going to be healthy, the outcome that you're getting out of it. You need to think about regularly as your circumstances change, your goals shift. How am I resetting my filter criteria to support this? So I think that's really important. The other thing I always say to people is think about setting it before you go actively hunting or actively decision making. And by that, I mean, we're really good at rationalizing things, which Lane has always said to me in another bit of her wisdom, is telling ourselves rational lies. So we are really good at after the fact rationalizing, telling ourselves rational lies about why it is that was the right decision, or why we chose to stick it out or to leave, or whatever the choice of outcome might have been. The key bit is making sure before I go into that situation, I know my frame for decision making. And so it has to filter through, as opposed to me constructing a filter afterwards that makes that make sense or justifies why I did something.
Yeah, I do love that. And it's funny, I've used a similar thing around that criteria when I was trying to make the decision of, do I do the business? Do I not do the business? Do I leave corporate? Do I not? And I had a similar process of, these are the criteria that I want, and does it meet that or not? And so it's quite powerful, I think, as a way of almost challenging your thinking. I've used a similar concept.
It's a great process for self-reflection too. It's just a really good way of checking in, pausing and checking in with yourself and going, actually, what matters to me in this moment? And then just making sure, I think one of the times we're most prone to, whether it's burnout, whether it's, more extreme situations from a mental health standpoint of not feeling the best version of ourselves for a prolonged period of time, is when we feel an incongruence with what we know to be true and what we know matters to us, and then the circumstances that we find ourselves in on a regular basis. And so I think that's one of the reasons I find this activity so powerful too, is it makes me feel like I'm more actively controlling what it is that I'm choosing to be involved with, and therefore setting myself up to have a greater level of fulfillment or enjoyment in what I'm doing. So I really encourage people to take a moment or two with a notebook at some point and work through thinking about their filter criteria for whatever decision is next on their horizon.
Yeah, I love that. I absolutely love it. So the next question I wanted to ask you, and this one's a daunting question to ask when you're writing questions, was you talk about, I was like, I don't know if I can ask this one. I'm having a moment of imposter syndrome. But you talk about how we can ask better questions. And I love in the book, you also reference, when you're in a meeting, what might be a better question to ask and considering that. And I love that. And it's really been making me think about, questions that I'm asking. Again, daunting when you're doing a podcast at this point in time, writing questions. How do we train ourselves? I could have done with this last week. How do we train ourselves to do that and to ask better questions?
Yeah, look, it is a great question to ask, and I think it's a great thing to be curious about in general for everyone listening, because broadly I make the observation in the book that as adults, we're not good question askers. If we want to go and find the peak question askers in our world, we need to go collect the 4-year-old girls in our lives, our nieces or grandkids or whoever it might be, and children, and study how they approach the world, because it is incessant and endless curiosity in the most amazing of ways. They ask so many questions a day, well over 400 by some estimates. And then you look at where we get to by the time we've turned into teenagers, and we're down to double digits. And then fortunately it doesn't improve from there. So the reality is, on a regular basis, before we even talk about better questions, we need to actually just be thoughtfully asking more questions. And I think the other thing too for me with questions is, are we asking questions with an intent to hear a reply? Because quite often when we're asking a question, we're already thinking about our response. Do we actually want to hear an answer, or are we asking a question with an intent just to reply? We're wanting to move the conversation along and get to our next opportunity to offer a comment. So the other thing is, are we asking questions with an intent to actually hear an answer and to sit and create space for the conversation that can come from it? So I think when it comes, they're the two places to start. So be curious and check in with yourself over the next 24 hours and just make a mental tally of how many questions have I asked in this 24-hour period. And once you've started to do that, if you're hitting more than 20 questions, that's fantastic. If you're not, how can I challenge myself behaviorally when I come into interactions to be more curious or to more actively ask questions? And then I think we start getting into the territory of what might be the better question to ask. And by that, I mean, at a base level, we're often wanting to move away from what we term closed questions. So they're questions that kind of naturally lead to a yes or no answer. So we're thinking about what are open questions going to be that are going to keep the conversation flowing and that are going to invite us to get into more interesting or different type of territory. So you might think about being curious, do I ask closed questions, or can I shift this question to an open question? What might move it from, do I think this is a good idea, to what might be an opportunity for how we could do this? And that's actually inviting people to be creative or to think divergently and things like of that nature. The other thing I would say is we actually have really good internal curiosity. What we've become really good at is suppressing it. And so the journey of courage, I often think in asking questions, is liberating your internal curiosity and going, if I find that interesting, then it's worthy to explore the question that I want to ask about it. And for me, it starts as simply as there. I mean, the other thing you can obviously do is there are a lot of people out there who are famously good at asking questions. There are great podcasters, there are great interviewers. Watching them and watching the conversation with a sense of how they ask questions and how they move through a conversation is a really great way of prompting yourself to think differently about how you might ask them too. But I think the baseline to begin with is, let's just focus on, are we asking questions? And are we asking questions with an intent to hear an answer and to move forward with open-ended conversation?
Yeah, the chapter bit about being the 4-year-old, or that really resonated with me, mainly because I have a 4-year-old. So
yes, you've got the sample. Absolutely.
That was an easy one for me, because I am being asked every day of the week about where is the hottest place on earth, where is the coldest place on earth, how does that work? Last night, which I didn't have a best answer to, is when the washing machine washes your clothes, where does it go? Where's it going there? Then does it end up in the tin?
I love it.
And you're just like, oh wow, I'm not sure. Like, honestly, Siri and Google's become my best friend for some of the questions that I don't have the answer to.
And I have no idea how parents did it in generations before Alexa and Siri and Google came along. But isn't it amazing? Like, thinking about where young brains go. And I just love that unfiltered curiosity. Again, that speaks to following your innate curiosity. If I don't understand it or that's interesting, I'm going to ask you about it, Mum. It's brilliant.
I saw a Simon Sinek interview once where he talked about that he was sitting in a meeting and didn't understand a point. So I was like, I'm going to, sorry, what does that mean? And then all of a sudden everyone was like, yeah, what does that mean? And no one wanted to be the person that asked the perceived silly, and I'm doing inverted commas if you're listening, like the silly question. And then as soon as he spoke up, he realized everybody else didn't understand it either, but no one wanted to ask the question.
Oh, truly. And, it's funny. I think when we think about courageous acts, we often think about things that are much more dramatic than that. And yet one of the greatest acts of courage I think we can do on a daily basis is be the person who asks the question in that room. Now, sometimes the question is, I don't understand that. Can you explain it? Sometimes the question is there another better way? Sometimes the question is, why are we choosing to take this approach? And it's actually challenging kind of some of the assumptions. But I think I'm amazed at how often we leave the room and no one's asked the question. Doesn't matter what the question should have been, we just haven't had the question asked. And I think regardless of where we end up, even if we move forward with the idea as it was originally presented, I can't help but think we're always better for the fact we've had the conversation. And we've aired concerns, or we've had to justify our thinking to make sure we're really confident about our reasoning, or we've brought more people into our view of the world that might have been assumed in the way that we announced the end outcome, but we've taken them through the understanding of how we got there. And so there's a greater level of buy-in across our broader team. But I think you're right. Like, so often we worry about how asking the question might be perceived. Will people think I'm silly? Will people think I'm not as smart as they are? Will I, is it a career limiting move? In some context where you lack psychological safety, that's the case. And one of the things I encourage leaders to pride themselves on is how many questions can you get out of your team in a meeting, and how actively are you prompting and provoking them? Because any questions is not a great prompt. That's the sort of thing where we're likely to watch tumbleweed roll through a room and hear the noise of crickets. We need to be thinking about how we invite people in a little bit more directly than just doing that.
I love that. I made a note of that one. It's great. I feel like it's just a personal mentoring session. I hope everyone's enjoying the personal mentoring session too. So, speaking of questions, I have been curious to ask you this question. I've been dying to ask you this question. You interviewed the most incredible people. I'm sure you get this one a lot, with Richard Branson, Barack Obama, Malcolm Gladwell. And I'm just really curious, what's the most sort of surprising or unexpected thing, I guess, that you didn't see coming for leaders that you have met that are at that level of playing an enormous behemoth game? Because I think there's the obvious things that we might think of, but I'm sure there's also ones that you went, oh, didn't see that.
I think if I think about it as a pattern across the group, and I'm always interested in patterns, like what, if anything, is a commonality amongst these very diverse, but to your point, all at the top of their field individuals. I would say the thing that I find both humbling and encouraging is how genuinely curious they still are and how actively they're learning in the interaction or in the conversation. You know, you watch Richard Branson, there's nowhere he doesn't go with a notebook and a pen, where when he hears something he's interested in, he writes a note down. He's more inclined to ask questions of the person sitting next to him on the panel than he is to want to take the microphone and speak for himself. You know, when you hear leaders like Obama talking, and, you know, a whole part of our conversation was around his methods for how he made decisions and how actively he sought out different perspectives and thoughtfully put together his cabinet. And I think he's the first US president in every city in the world that he went to. He met with young people because he wanted to understand what they were thinking and where their perspective of things was. So I think you have this constant sense of an eagerness to learn, whether that's in testing and challenging their own thinking, or whether that's just an openness to new ideas and different perspectives. There's a hunger for that. There's not an intellectual arrogance, even though there's a confidence with each of these individuals. They have a worldview, they have a set of beliefs, they're very clear on what they stand from, but that's held in tension with this intellectual humility and this desire to truly practice lifelong learning. And I think that astounded me, and as I said, in so many ways encouraged me, because you like to think that's one of those traits that you see in individuals at that level. But I can say certainly in the sample set that I've had the great privilege of interviewing, who are that caliber and tier of leader who've sustained success in their respective field and broken through to that level of influence, that is certainly a common characteristic to them.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I've seen a lot with Richard Branson on that in particular. Have you just watched his documentary that came out?
No, but I've got it on my list. I want to watch it this weekend. I keep seeing it pop up, but I haven't had a chance to yet. Is it good?
Oh, so good. I'm not going to ruin it for you.
Right.
So we won't talk about it. But he does cover that around his curiosity, always having a pad and a pen is one of his tips. Yeah, I love that. I love that. So one question I want to ask you is, on the flip side, what is a leadership myth that you just want to bust? And you hear all the time and just go, I would love to bust that.
I think in the context of maybe who's listening, that there's this magical moment in your life where someone comes and dangles you the leadership keys and hands them over. Like, that's this ceremonial initiation ritual that you're invited into at some point. Where in reality, that's sort of yours to be claimed at any moment you choose to embrace that word for yourself and take on both the opportunity and the responsibility that comes with that word and that title. So I think there's a lot of waiting for the leader and or waiting to arrive at leadership. Yeah. And I think what I wish is that more people would step into that now, and as opposed to thinking that's above my pay grade, outside my responsibility, not my role, etc., that's something that we can lean into and say, well, what might I do about it? Because if it's in our culture, if it's impacting my people, if it's affecting our bottom line, what have you, then it is my responsibility. I've got something as a person in this dynamic organization, whatever it might be, that I can do something about it. And at the same time, I think that notion that you don't have to wait until you're 65 with grey hair and you've finally climbed your way up a ladder for 35 years to decide that that's the moment that you're officially a leader. I think particularly at this moment, we just so desperately need more diverse and new voices in leadership, that I'd encourage anyone listening to think about what might leaning more into that word and everything that comes with it mean for you in your world and your work.
Yeah, I love that, because there's no perfect moment or perfect time, or it's the whole nobody's ever ready yet concept.
Yes, 100%. I'm a big believer in the idea of starting before you're ready, because I fundamentally believe readiness is a mirage. You never truly arrive there, but the challenge with mirages, they always look like they're not far away, and they look so much better and sexier than where you are right now. And so we all hold off thinking that, just around the corner, the ducks will finally line up and everything will be perfect, and then I can apply for that role or choose to do that or take that leap. Like, no, that it's never going to be perfect. Challenge yourself to start before you're ready, and think about what taking that step now, next week, whatever it might be, could look like.
Yeah, I loved your example of that. with the triathlon, with the Ironman, that you did it with like 100 days notice, because that challenged me, where I'm like, oh, I need this much time to train, or I need this much time to do this, or just in life, around the time that you need. And some of your examples in the book, I think, are fantastic at challenging your thinking and your beliefs on that.
Oh, and as you know, I mean, that story starts from me being challenged on my own beliefs. Like, I was sitting next to someone at a dinner who challenged me. I was sort of giving the excuse that I'd always want to do one of those things, but I travel a lot and this and this and this and whatever my list of reasons why I couldn't was. And he put me right back in my place. He called bullshit on it. And he said, well, I've done all of this while I've been, in a job that was much more senior than mine, traveling twice as many days a week as I was. And with raising a family and a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't in my dynamic at that moment in time. And I went, yeah, you're right. I'm choosing to tell myself a story that I can't do that, or I'm choosing to make excuses. If this is something that I want to do, then, well, pulled out my phone at dinner that night and signed up. Now, I don't recommend everyone does an Ironman on a 100-day standing start. It's that's certainly a couch to summit effort in that regard. A hack job in the most extreme of senses in that regard. But I think the notion of what's stopping you, or why not now, is a really powerful question to ask ourselves, because really it comes back to, is it something that you're going to do? Is it something that you want to do? And if the answer is yes to one or both of those things, I think it's a question of what's stopping you. And are those beliefs or excuses that you need to challenge yourself on or break down, because in reality they're the only limitation between you getting out there and having a go.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the example. The Ironman example was a brilliant example. My brother is a running and triathlon coach, and when I was falling off the wagon on my training, he said, Abby, Barack Obama used to train every morning before going into the office when he was president. Do you perceive that you have more to do than Barack Obama? And I was like, well, yeah, no, all my excuses have just completely and utterly gone. But it was great. It was a great reframe.
Very useful sometimes. That's exactly what we need.
So before you go, I've got to ask you two things. So one is book. I always ask this question and finish this question around, other than your own, and we love Holly's book, what book has had the biggest impact on you and you recommend to others?
How Will You Measure Your Life by Clayton Christensen. Brilliant read, Harvard professor, applying the principles of business to the way that you think through your own personal life and decision making. And there was just a handful of really powerful concepts. I read it early in my career, and there's still frames I come back to when I think about, particularly for those who go and read it, the power and the consciousness we need to have around making decision at the margin without awareness of the full cost when it comes to our own lives. And show me your checkbook and I'll show you who you are when it comes to personal investment and what we put our dollar, time, effort, and energy into. So that book has been really powerful in my life.
I have just written that down. Sounds like that needs to be one of my mountain reading ones as well, because that sounds like a super high impact book. Thank you. So Holly, before you go, I have to get you to talk about the Epic Challenge. And this is a selfish request, actually. I'm going to throw it out and say how selfish I am. I've read the book and now I want to put it into action. And like we just talked about, do the doing. And so I had to sign up to the Epic Challenge because I like that accountability, that level of prompting and sort of being on the hook. So I need fellow friends who want to join me for this challenge. So this isn't about you at all. This is just about me getting some fellow friends.
We're recruiting for Abby's team. I love it.
We're recruiting for team. Can I have my own team? Can we have Team Abby? Talk to us about Epic, because and the reason I want you to talk about this is I think it's so powerful to go, right, what we've talked about, how do we actually take that to the next step and put it into action and be helped guided through this process?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited that you're going to be part of the next challenge. I mean, Epic was for me the extension of the book, when we talked right at the top of this conversation that the goal was to how do we help more people go from knowing to doing. And in reality, we know that it's great. And there's some of us that are really proactive and will do the reading and do the reflection and think about, how those ideas might apply in our lives. But most of us need a little bit of a structure, a little bit of support, and a bit of help in sort of staying committed to the follow through on some of it. And so what we did was went and gamified the book and broke down these kind of core leadership ideas and principles and went, okay, if we think about the idea of you might do a 28-day fitness program to get yourself ready and raring to go from a physical fitness standpoint, why wouldn't we build the leadership gymnasium where you can go to work on your skills and capabilities? This challenge coming up in August is going to be all around leading the change. So the book is split in two halves. The first half is all about leading yourself. The second half is all about leading others. And so we'll be moving into a challenge that's really going to be about the second half of the book. So helping you build your sphere of influence, helping you think about how you motivate and encourage and inspire others. How do you mobilize more people towards achieving a goal or a business outcome? How do you think thoughtfully about communication, and impact, all that sort of stuff. So we've got a really rich kind of curriculum of ideas on how you go to work in leading others. And it's all condensed into this month-long challenge where every day you get a challenge that you can complete in less than 15 minutes. It's gamified. You can play for points. You can join Abby's team or you can start your own. And the goal is to really help people. And it's been astonishing. I mean, we've been running Epic Challenges for over 2 years now, watching not just the completion rates of people putting these ideas to work and getting the benefit of them in their lives. That's been incredible. But the community that's built around it, these people who don't know each other that are championing and cheering each other on every day. One of the things I love that one of our participants said last quarter is this is like finally the positive social media feed I've wanted in my life, because every day it's a whole bunch of people that are conquering goals, putting themselves out beyond their comfort zone, and achieving, personal and professional growth markers. And so it's just phenomenal to be a part of. And I really love every month that we run challenges. So if you're up for it, we'll maybe Abby can put the link in the show notes. But if you want to join the Epic Challenge, it'll be kicking off in August. We'd love to have you. And it's all around leading the change this quarter.
Perfect. And you can join as an individual or you can join as a team. Is that right? You can do both?
Yep. Whatever way you want to play. And you can also join as an individual. And then as you meet people on the challenge, you can buddy up with them and make a team. What I really wanted to do with building this product was support both people who wanted to opt in a way that maybe sometimes they were struggling to get the support inside their organizations, or be the ones that got selected for the leadership development program. And also, as a small medium enterprise owner myself, I appreciate that a lot of the stuff that's in the market for us is just so beyond the price point that I could go and put my whole team on it. So the goal with Epic was to really build something that was accessible so that people in, 90% of Australian businesses are small and medium enterprises, right? We should have things available that can allow that engine of our economy to be able to grow to the fullest heights of what it's capable of. So that was a big part of the goal for Epic too.
Perfect. So I'm going to put the link in the show notes. I'm doing it because selfishly I go to Switzerland on the 2nd of August. So I feel like I'm going to then have the day hiking to reflect on whatever the question and whatever the homework is. And then I can do it by the end of the day. So if you want to come join me, that's where we're going to be hanging out in August.
Awesome. Can't wait. I'm excited to have you in it and watch you blow up the leaderboard, no doubt.
Oh, there's a challenge. Holly, thank you so much. I've absolutely loved having you on. I will put all your links in the show notes so people can connect with you. And thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, Abby.
Before you leave us, doors have officially opened for our next intake of Rev Up. Doors will be closing on the 30th of June. Now, if you have not heard about Rev Up, this is our new revenue enablement where your revenue generating teams will all come together to learn from leading experts. The experts that we have lined up to teach the Rev Up system are absolutely incredible. We have LinkedIn teaching social selling. We have Julie Masters teaching influence. We have Maz Farrelly, whose content has had 8 billion views, teaching us about storytelling and standing out from the crowd. We have Jay Pottinger teaching us about productivity and many more. We will go through the entire journey of how do you rev up your sales aligned to these leading experts. So if you want to check out Rev Up before the doors close on the 30th of June, then simply click the link in our show notes and visit member.salesredefined.com.au and you can find out all the details you need to know, or you can book in for a chat. We love to have a chat to see whether it's the right fit for your revenue generating teams.